Why would someone abduct a woman from her own home, drive her across the city, force her to withdraw money, and then kill her anyway? In this video, we'll talk about Eve Carson and what happened to her. Eve Carson was the kind of person people described using words like remarkable and unforgettable. Born on November 19, 1985 in Athens, Georgia, Eve stood out early, not because she demanded attention but because she earned it. From a young age, she carried herself with purpose. In high school, she wasn't just academically strong, she was deeply involved. She served as vice president of the student council, volunteered at a nursing home, worked with a shelter for abused teens, and even assisted in a stem cell research lab, all while maintaining top grades. She was the student teachers pointed to as an example, the kind who made others believe hard work truly paid off. After graduating with honors, Eve enrolled at the University of North Carolina, where she pursued a demanding double major in political science and biology. Her academic excellence earned her a highly competitive scholarship, one awarded to only a select few. But Eve didn't stop at excelling in the classroom. On campus, she quickly emerged as a leader. She took on key roles in student organizations, mentored younger students, and became someone many quietly admired. Professors spoke highly of her. Friends trusted her. She had a reputation for being disciplined, compassionate, and relentlessly driven. Beyond the university, Eve continued giving her time to others. She taught science at a local elementary school. She volunteered abroad, spending a summer in Ecuador assisting doctors, studying for a semester in Cuba, and joining a research team in Egypt. These weren't resume fillers. This was who she was. Someone who believed knowledge meant little if it wasn't used to help others. By her final year at UNC, Eve was only 22 years old, yet her future was already taking shape. She had secured a job offer from a major company even before graduation. While most students worried about what came next, Eve was already preparing for it. She lived off campus with a close group of friends, balancing her studies with a full, meaningful life. Everything about her story pointed forward, to success, to impact, to a long future still unfolding. No one could have imagined that all of it would end suddenly. And no one could have predicted that the place she felt safest, her own home, would be where her story took its darkest turn. March 5th began like any other ordinary day in Eve Carson's life. Classes, responsibilities, plans for the future. Nothing about the day hinted that it would be her last. That evening, Eve was at the off-campus home she shared with a close-knit group of friends. The house was familiar, comfortable, and safe, or at least it felt that way. As the night wore on, her roommates began getting ready to go out to a party. It was the kind of spontaneous late-night plan college students make without a second thought. They invited Eve to come along. She declined. Eve had classes coming up and work she wanted to finish. Staying in to study wasn't unusual for her. She was disciplined, focused, and known for putting her responsibilities first. There was no argument, no hesitation, just a simple decision to stay home while the others headed out. Around 1:30 a.m., the roommates left the house, believing Eve would still be there when they returned. Inside, Eve settled into her routine. Her laptop was open. The lights were on. She was studying exactly where she intended to be. For the next several hours, the house remained quiet. Sometime during the early morning hours, something changed. Investigators would later learn that Eve's computer remained active until around 3:30 a.m., confirming she was still awake and working long after her roommates had gone. That detail became crucial. It meant she hadn't left immediately after they did. Whatever happened to her occurred later, silently, without anyone else in the house to hear it. At approximately 4:30 a.m., the roommates returned home. What greeted them felt wrong almost instantly. The front door was wide open. The lights were still on. Eve wasn't there. At first, confusion set in. Maybe she had stepped out briefly, maybe something unexpected had come up. But the longer they stood there, the heavier the silence felt. Eve's car was gone. She hadn't left a note. She hadn't answered her phone. This wasn't like her. Why would Eve leave in the middle of the night? Why would she leave the door unlocked? And why wouldn't she tell anyone where she was going? The questions stacked up quickly, each more unsettling than the last. They tried calling again, still no answer. As minutes stretched into hours, hope slowly gave way to dread. By morning, the reality became impossible to ignore. Eve Carson hadn't just stepped out. She was gone. And somewhere beyond that quiet house, a far darker truth was already waiting to be discovered. By the time morning arrived, the uneasy feeling inside the house had grown impossible to shake. Eve still hadn't returned. Her phone went straight to voicemail. Her bed was untouched. The front door, once left wide open, now felt like a silent accusation, proof that something had gone terribly wrong during the night. At first, her roommates tried to make sense of it. Maybe Eve had gone out unexpectedly. Maybe she'd run into someone she knew. But the more they thought about it, the less it added up. Eve wasn't impulsive. She didn't disappear without telling someone. And she certainly wouldn't leave her home unsecured in the middle of the night. As the hours passed, fear began to replace confusion. One of Eve's friends finally made the call to police. When officers arrived and listened to the details, the open door, the missing car, the unanswered phone, their reaction was immediate. This wasn't being treated as a routine missing person case. Something else had already happened that morning. Police asked one of Eve's friends to come with them. Earlier that same day, just hours before the call came in, officers had responded to a disturbing report in a neighborhood about a mile away. A resident had been jolted awake around 5:00 a.m. by the sound of gunshots, followed by a scream. Terrified, she called 911. When police arrived at the scene, they found the body of a young woman lying on the ground. She had been shot multiple times. There was no identification on her, no phone, no wallet, nothing that could immediately tell officers who she was. At the time, she was just another unnamed victim in the early hours of the morning. Now police needed confirmation. They showed the photo to Eve's friend. The recognition was instant and devastating. It was Eve. The timeline suddenly snapped into place. Eve had last been known to be alive sometime after 3:30 a.m. when her computer was still active. Less than 2 hours later, her body was discovered miles from home. Somewhere in between, she had been taken from her house, driven away, and killed. Investigators returned to the house to search for answers. Inside Eve's room, they found more disturbing clues. Her wallet was missing. Her credit cards were gone. Her car was nowhere to be found. The medical examiner would later confirm there were no signs of sexual assault, narrowing the possible motive. Everything pointed toward robbery, but even that raised more questions than it answered. Why take her instead of running? Why drive her away from her home? And why kill her after getting what they wanted? As news of Eve's death spread, shock rippled through the university and beyond. A campus that had felt safe only days earlier was now gripped by fear. Students locked their doors, watched strangers closely, and waited for answers. But at that moment, police had none. All they knew was that Eve Carson hadn't vanished on her own. Someone had taken her, and the hunt for the truth had just begun. With the confirmation of Eve Carson's identity, the case shifted instantly from a disappearance to a homicide investigation. Detectives now faced a narrow but critical window of time, and a growing list of questions that refused to align. The first task was establishing when Eve had been taken. Forensic analysts examined her laptop and confirmed it had been actively used until approximately 3:30 a.m. that detail mattered. It meant Eve was alive and inside her home for at least 2 hours after her roommates left. She hadn't gone out on a whim. She hadn't been lured away earlier in the night. Something had happened after 3:30 a.m. Then came the second timestamp. At around 5:00 a.m., police received the emergency call from a woman living about a mile away. She reported waking up to the sound of gunshots, followed by a scream. Officers arrived minutes later and found Eve's body on the ground in a quiet residential area. That left investigators with a chilling conclusion. Somewhere between 3:30 and 5:00 a.m., Eve had been confronted in her own home, forced to leave, driven away, and killed. The next question was how. There were no signs of a struggle inside the house. Nothing appeared broken or overturned. That suggested Eve may have opened the door willingly, or at least without immediate resistance. But to whom? And why in the middle of the night? Detectives then turned their attention to what was missing. Eve's car was gone, so were her wallet and credit cards. Those facts pushed investigators toward a possible motive, robbery, but even that explanation felt incomplete. Most robberies don't involve abducting the victim and driving them miles away. Most don't end in execution-style gunfire. The medical examiner's report added another layer. There were no signs of sexual assault, ruling out one of the most common motives in crimes like this. The focus returned to money, but again, the method made no sense. Why not take what you can and leave? Why keep her alive? Why move her at all? As detectives mapped out Eve's last known movements, another troubling detail emerged. Her phone had last pinged off a tower near a highway just outside town. The phone itself was never recovered. Investigators believed it had been deliberately discarded, likely tossed into wooded terrain to prevent tracking. Someone knew what they were doing. Fear spread quickly across the campus and surrounding community. Eve wasn't just another student, she was everywhere. Student groups she led, classes she attended, friends she mentored. Her death felt personal to thousands of people. Students flooded police with tips. Every unfamiliar face, every strange car, every late-night sound was reported. But despite the volume of information, investigators were still missing one thing. A suspect. They had a victim. They had a tight timeline. They had a missing car. And soon, that missing car would become the key that cracked the case wide open. With no suspects in sight, detectives shifted their focus to what little evidence they had left behind. If the motive truly was robbery, then money, cold, traceable, unforgiving, might tell the story Eve no longer could. They began with her bank records. What they found immediately raised alarms. Just 18 minutes after Eve's computer activity ended, someone attempted to withdraw cash from her account. Not once, but twice. A total of $700 was taken in rapid succession, the maximum allowed under her daily withdrawal limit. Additional attempts were made, but they failed. Eve was already dead, or very close to it. The ATM used for those withdrawals was located near a shopping center on the far side of town, nowhere near Eve's home or where her body was found. Investigators moved quickly, requesting the security footage. This time, the cameras delivered something real. The video showed Eve's car pulled up to the ATM. Behind the wheel sat a man calmly using her bank card. In the back seat, there appeared to be another figure, motionless, difficult to see. Investigators feared the worst. Could that shadowy shape have been Eve herself? Alive, already injured, the image quality was too poor to say. Forensic specialists tried enhancing the footage, but it revealed no clear face. Still, it confirmed something critical. Eve hadn't been killed immediately. She had been driven around. As detectives dug deeper, they uncovered a disturbing pattern. Eve's card had been used, or attempted to be used, at multiple ATMs across the city. The withdrawals traced a route, almost like breadcrumbs, marking the path her killers took while trying to drain her account. Most of the machines, unfortunately, didn't have cameras. Then 2 days later, the case took another turn. On March 7th, just after midnight, an alert came in for a declined transaction at a 24-hour convenience store in a neighboring town. Officers rushed to the location, knowing this store had working surveillance cameras. The footage showed a man using Eve's card. But it wasn't the same man from the first ATM video. Investigators were stunned. Now they faced two possibilities. Either multiple people were involved in Eve's murder, or her card had been passed between accomplices. Neither option was comforting. Once again, the footage was grainy. Faces were unclear. No license plates were visible, but police knew one thing for certain now. This wasn't a random, impulsive crime. It was coordinated. With the trail growing colder by the hour, detectives made a crucial decision. They released both sets of ATM images to the public, hoping someone, anyone, would recognize the men. Tips poured in, phones rang nonstop, everyone wanted to help. And then days later, one call would change everything. A name, spoken quietly, would finally give investigators a direction. And it would lead them straight to the people responsible. Days passed with no solid arrest. And the pressure on investigators intensified. Eve's face was everywhere, on the news, on flyers, on the minds of a shaken community desperate for answers. Then, on March 12th, the silence finally broke. An anonymous caller contacted police. The caller claimed to recognize the man shown in the convenience store ATM footage. He provided a name, Dario Atwater. Detectives moved fast. Atwater was only 21 years old, but his criminal history was extensive: robbery, assault, drug offenses, and repeated run-ins with law enforcement. He had been incarcerated before and released early more than once. Even more troubling, investigators discovered that just 2 days after Eve's murder, Atwater had been scheduled to appear in court for carrying a handgun while on probation. Police pulled his mugshots and compared them to the ATM footage. The resemblance was unmistakable. They also learned Atwater lived just a short distance from the convenience store where Eve's card had been used. With mounting evidence, detectives brought him in for questioning. Atwater denied any involvement, but the surveillance footage and transaction records were enough to place him under arrest. As the investigation deepened, another name surfaced. Phone records revealed Atwater had been in frequent contact with a 17-year-old named Lawrence Levitt. Despite his age, Levitt already had a criminal record. When detectives examined his mugshot, they immediately recognized him as the driver in the first ATM video, the man seen behind the wheel of Eve's car. Unlike Atwater, Levitt didn't surrender quietly. When officers went to arrest him, he barricaded himself inside his home, forcing police to call in a SWAT team. After a tense standoff, he was taken into custody. Like Atwater, he denied any role in Eve's death. But the evidence kept stacking up. Cell phone data placed both suspects near Eve's neighborhood during the early morning hours of March 5th, far from where either of them lived. Investigators now believed Eve had not been targeted personally. She had been chosen at random, simply because she was alone. Faced with the brutality of the crime, prosecutors made their intentions clear. They would seek the death penalty for Dario Atwater. That announcement changed everything. Under the weight of that decision, Atwater agreed to a plea deal. In exchange for removing the death penalty, he would confess and testify. What he revealed next would confirm investigators' worst fears and expose the terrifying reality of Eve's final hours. The truth was finally coming into focus, and it was far darker than anyone had imagined. Faced with the possibility of the death penalty, Dario Atwater finally broke. In exchange for his life being spared, he agreed to plead guilty and tell investigators exactly what happened the night Eve Carson was taken. According to Atwater, the plan had never been about Eve specifically. He and Lawrence Levitt had gone out that night looking for anyone, to rob for quick cash. As they drove through a neighborhood near the university, they noticed a house with lights on. Through a window, they saw Eve inside, alone. They chose her. Armed, they forced their way into the house and confronted Eve. She was taken against her will and forced into her own car. Over the next several hours, they drove from ATM to ATM, pressuring her to withdraw money while attempting to empty her account. Atwater admitted that throughout the ordeal, Eve pleaded with them. She told them she wouldn't report what happened. She only wanted to go home. But the decision had already been made. Atwater confessed that they feared Eve had seen their faces. They hadn't worn disguises. Letting her live, they believed, was a risk they weren't willing to take. Eventually, they drove her to a quiet area and ended her life. In one of the most heartbreaking details revealed, Atwater admitted that just before it happened, Eve asked them to pray with her. They didn't. With the confession in hand, the case moved swiftly through the courts. In April 2010, Atwater was sentenced to life in prison plus 30 years, spared from execution because of his plea deal. During sentencing, he turned toward Eve's parents, apologized, and acknowledged that he deserved his punishment. Lawrence Levitt chose a different path. He refused to plead guilty, and his trial began in December 2011. Despite his defense team's arguments, the evidence, including Atwater's confession and cell phone data, proved overwhelming. Levitt was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. His sentence was later overturned on appeal due to a ruling against mandatory life sentences for juveniles. He was granted a new trial. This time, he spoke openly in court, claiming he wasn't the monster people believed him to be. The judge was unconvinced. Once again, Levitt received life in prison. Eve Carson's death sent shockwaves far beyond the courtroom. New legislation was passed in North Carolina, imposing tougher penalties related to violent and gang-associated crimes. At the University of North Carolina, a scholarship was created in Eve's name, along with a memorial garden honoring her life. Her story didn't end in violence. It lives on in the change it inspired, the lives it continues to touch, and the memory of a young woman who should have had decades ahead of her, but instead left a legacy that will never be forgotten.